All right, in our second longer discussion on media and society, we're going to be looking at issues of access and control in the age of social media. This is an issue firstly known as the digital divide. This is the gap between those who have access and literacy, and we'll discuss what that means, to media and technology and those who do not. Now, if we think about how much of our lives is on the internet these days, in COVID, this has become more apparent than ever. We see that some people have access to high-speed internet and computers and others do not. And this breakdown happens along pretty uh, predictable lines that those, as we see, who are older, so 65 or higher, um, and who are poorer are much less likely and less educated are less likely to be on the internet, to be active on the internet. Part of what this reflects is generational trends. But if we think about the fact of how much of our connectivity in our society depends on our expectations that people are on the internet, then we can start to see where problems might arise from this. We need the internet often to get jobs, to uh, sign up for programs, to get government documents. All of these things can be done electronically now. And if you don't have internet access, that means you might be frozen out of those systems. So a lack of internet access is increasingly important. And as again, we move our lives online, if you don't have a computer or internet access, this means that you're frozen out of even more of those activities. So we see that those who are falling behind in the pandemic are largely poor um, children, predominantly from black and brown neighborhoods, but not entirely. And also we might note those who live in rural areas. 78% you might note of rural communities are on the internet. This kind of pattern extends globally as well. Um, this measure of network readiness globally shows us that there are large swaths of the world that are less well off than us, that also have lots of issues with internet access. And again, if we think about how crucial this sort of access is to so much of our lives today, imagine being somewhere where you have to have dial-up, where you have to have, if you have dial-up at all, and if you don't have real internet access. In rural and globally speaking, where there is lack of access, part of the issue is that it costs a lot of money to build cable networks. As much as we talk about satellite data and some companies are launching more and more satellites to transmit information, still a lot of the highest speed transactions happen through physical lines that are laid down across the ocean or um, across the land. Fiber optics are the fastest kind, and those are um, very slow to roll out because it's very expensive. And if you have a certain number of people out in the country, in rural Georgia, for example, most companies, most for-profit companies, don't necessarily see that as a profitable venture. So many of those communities still rely on dial-up access. So one of the key problems is that for those who are less well off in society, they have less access, and this in turn makes them less well off. It's a continuing cycle. And part of what we'll discuss is what does this look like today as we do so much of our lives online in this pandemic. Another key issue is the issue of context collapse. Context collapse refers to when two different contexts or two different sort of parts of our lives are collapsed without us wanting them to be. Many of us have experienced this in our media and social media use. If we have friends, for example, um, and family on our social media, and our friends post a picture of us drinking a beer or in the middle of a party smoking a cigarette, and then our grandma comments on it. I'm like, what are you doing that for? Uh, part of what's happening here is two different contexts are being collapsed into one through being on the same social media. Um, so this is what we call the difficulty of impression management. We try to manage different audiences' impression of us. We want our parents to think we're good little students, and we want our friends to think we're cool and go to parties. So how do we manage those impressions? How do we keep those separate contexts? Many of my student athletes are very careful with their social media because they know that potential schools might be coming through them. And so part of the reality of the world we live in is that young people and old people alike have to be increasingly sensitive to who's looking at their information. How do they keep some things private? Um, and as well as the fact that many young folks can seem to forget that these social media can easily be transmitted to contexts outside of those they begin in. So recently, a UGA fraternity was suspended because they had a GroupMe set up for their fraternity that was all kinds of racist and problematic and sexist and homophobic. And of course, in the context of their little fraternity, their little brotherhood, um, this was fine for them because it's usually a bunch of wealthy white guys in a house, literally. But it's easy for that context to collapse. And once those things leave the context of the fraternity and go out into the world, then they have to start making apologies and to try to backpedal on their previous behavior. This is an increasing thing for many young people today. Before the pandemic, I know some teenagers were arrested for distributing child pornography when what they were doing was using Snapchat to send naked pictures to one another. But technically what they're doing is sending naked pictures of an underage person. So how we use media and the context in which it's used is an important and pressing issue today as well. Lastly, we can think about how media operates as a form of social control. In our social media as well as in the news and in many different forms of technology, um, there are groups with interests pursuing those interests and trying to control our behavior. In insidious ways, this involves advertising and organizations like political parties trying to persuade us one way or another on particular issues. But in other ways, many of the media we consume every day in terms of movies, television, songs, they have messages, they have norms, they transmit these norms and ideas. And these can serve as to give us particular impressions. Ruha Benjamin, Dr. Benjamin, is a sociologist who looks increasingly at how race and racism are built into technology and coding, what she calls the new Jim Code. Um, for example, many early crime detection apps, one of the earliest, the most popular ones now, started off with a rather racist name, and then was changed when it became more popular. This is built into, if you've ever had the experience that a soap dispenser won't dispense soap automatically, many sensors and technologies are sensitized to lighter skin because they are coded by white folks. Part of what we'll think about in another video is how social media themselves are designed to keep us on them, to keep us clicking, to keep us doom scrolling, and some tips on how that happens. So when we think about technology and media, we can't think of it as something that's just simply there, a tool to be used, because tools are created by people, and we need to think about who made the tools and who gets to control them. Network television, for example, has a huge race issue, and this is slowly changing, but some networks have 100% of their shows that have no black showrunners or writers. Showrunner is the person who does all the creative, kind of like the director of a show in general. Um, very few black women, very few women at all. So if we think about some of the messages and stories that are pervasive in our media, I mean, how many cop dramas do we have out there? And how do they show the cops? We can start to see where some of these issues with representation in media come from. We can also think about how do we address these issues? How do we start to change some of these social problems?